Hoy ha estado un día en lo que no he hecho mucho.
Literalmente puedo grabar un vídeo de YouTube en español. So today's video is slightly different and it's from the heart, right? It's something that is dear to me and something that I enjoy, but I think that a lot of you guys that are watching this now want to improve, and that is how I learned Spanish in a pretty short period of time given the circumstances, right? And the thing is, how I started with Spanish was far from ideal. In school, you know, curricular activity, something you had to do, and the way they taught it was completely bogus because you go to each class and every time you come out, maybe you learn a word or two. But did you actually speak any more of the language than before you went into the class or before you even started the class in that year? Probably not, probably not. So yeah, after coming out of school and I'm kind of finding what I like to do, I realized that I was getting recommended a lot of language content on YouTube, right? I could come across the likes of Lao Shu, RIP, may God rest his soul, Ikena, Jaume, etc, doing all these cool things like speaking all these crazy languages, and then I'm thinking to myself, there's no way these guys learn these languages in school, right? And once I realized, like, damn, you can actually teach yourself a language to fluency and speak to natives like that and have reactions like that, I was like, damn, okay, I'm gonna try that. So what was the first thing that I did when I realized that teaching yourself a language was actually a possibility? Well, I started with an app called Pimsleur. And Pimsleur, I am not sponsored, but a lot of people are sponsored by them, and for good reason. It's basically a conversation-based app where you listen to a conversation from start to finish. At start, you know nothing. By the end, you understand the whole conversation. That's the goal, right? And then through that, you pick up little words. So that's the first thing I started doing. And when I realized how much more beneficial that was, and that sort of learning was compared to sitting in a class, learning a vocabulary list, reading off the whiteboard. Once I realized how much more beneficial that was, it was kind of like, wow, this is a revelation. So I started doing that 30 minutes a day because they're 30-minute lessons. And from there, what did I start doing? And that's when I started to realize that when you take this list of vocabulary that you have and you only listen to it but don't find a way to retain it, that's when you basically just lose the game already. So what did I start doing? I started using Anki. That's it right there, Anki, okay? That app is basically a spaced repetition app. So you put a bunch of words in a deck, in a flashcard deck, and basically it shows you the words that you remember the best, the least, and vice versa. The words that you don't remember as easily, it gives you a little bit of time to just get used to the words, so it keeps showing it to you over and over and over again. And once I started listening to Pimsleur, getting these 30-minute conversations down and writing all the vocabulary that I could identify as useful into Anki and then practicing them as flashcards as a spaced repetition system, that's when I started to consolidate my first actual usable vocabulary in Spanish. And there's one other trick with Anki. Not only was I inputting my own words that I would find from the Pimsleur lessons I was listening to and other areas of my learning, I actually downloaded, which you can find for most languages that are out there, pre-made decks that basically have the 1,000 most frequent words in the language, right? And this is the key. The reason why this is impactful is because if you're studying the 1,000 most frequent words used on a day-to-day basis in a language, that means that if you master those words or get to a point where you can basically spew those words out easily without thinking, then all of a sudden you're on your way to understanding a lot more than you probably ever did in school, or if not in school, in your life. So when you're watching a show, a series, whatever, you'll be able to pick out more phrases that you understand than if you were to ignore this step and not take the 1,000 most common words in a language and decide not to learn. I'm gonna learn how to say flying saucer in Spanish. Like, it doesn't make sense. I literally learned that today. It was platillo volador. But that's like a completely irrelevant word on your day-to-day basis in terms of your journey to fluency. You don't need to know how to say that yet, right? So these are words that are relevant. But if you focus on words like I want, I love, I wish, I do, I play, that will take you so much further, so much quicker than the guy who's still stuck learning irrelevant words on Duolingo. Once you've downloaded these sorts of decks that are available online, you've found resources that do the same thing, which teach you the 1,000 most common words in a language, common verbs, etc. That's when you're in a position to start immersing yourself properly, which you should have been doing from day one, really. And I will say, from the moment you decide you want to learn a language, you need to start listening to it, okay? And this is called immersion. And think about languages, right? This is the thing. This is what helped me most, and a lot of people have covered this, and it makes a lot of sense, and this is why I can talk Spanish and understand Spanish. Is because imagine how you learned English or your native language, if it's not English, as a baby. You were simply growing up and you were exposed to the language on a daily basis. You have all these random humans talking to you that you've barely known because you've barely been alive, but they just keep saying these weird sounds to you. You don't understand them. But slowly over time, you start to associate these sounds with actual real things that have meaning and significance. And then your brain starts to compile all of this information, and then you start to go from the stage of input where you're taking all these sounds in to now you're trying to say them you could to suggest a certain thing that you want to express in real life. And that's how you learn as a baby, is input, constant input for years. You're not going to say a word for a little while, and then eventually your first words come out, and then you start building from there. The output starts coming. But guess what comes first is the input. So this is where school's weird, because as much as they do give you input in the form of like textbooks and vocab lists, etc., they never want to actually speak the language to you for a prolonged period of time. At least in England, I'm talking about in my school. I don't know if your schools are different, right? But in a lot of schools, they won't focus on you just listening to the language, which is a very big key. With Pimsleur, you're kind of already doing that, right? That's why I recommend it. With Anki, you're taking the sounds that you're hearing and you're ensuring that they stay in your mind, okay? By seeing them and refreshing yourself every single day. To basically make all of this work and come together, you need to be constantly exposing yourself to language. So eventually I got to a point where I didn't need Pimsleur because I could actually listen to basic, beginner level and intermediate podcasts, right? So on my way to the gym, which I go to every day, I will go for a walk, which takes me 10,000 steps roughly there and back. And during that walk, I'm not listening to music. I'm not listening to an English podcast, although it pains me sometimes because I do want to listen to English podcasts, but I know that I have priorities, I have goals, I want to improve my Spanish. So I use that time to put on a Spanish podcast, and I'll be walking and listening and trying to pick out phrases. I'll have my phone out. Sometimes I'll stop and I will literally take my phone out, and I'm going to recommend an app that I use to translate words that I hear, which isn't Google Translate because sometimes that can be very inaccurate, and that's Spanish Dictionary. So I'll be walking, I'll be listening, I'll hear a phrase, oh, that would be useful if I could figure out what that means, because I can hear the context of what they're saying, it kind of makes sense. Okay, let me go on Spanish Dictionary, I'll type it in, take the meaning of that, and then make a flashcard for it, basically on the spot as I'm walking, or I'll make a note of it in my notes and turn them to flashcards later. But the point is, I'm now immersing myself, I'm simulating the environment of basically being in a Spanish-speaking country. And that's the thing, a lot of people want to make excuses, oh, I can't learn language because I live in the country. That means nothing, bro. I can listen to whatever podcast I want and understand basically 97% of it, simply due to the fact that I've simulated my immersion for so long and I stay consistent with it. So every time I walk, every single day, I am listening to Spanish. That's what you need to do. You need to find a way to do that. Now at the beginning, in whatever language you're learning, it's going to be hard for you to actually understand anything on a podcast, but that doesn't matter. Your goal isn't to understand at first, it's just to expose your brain to the patterns and the flow of the language, and then slowly you'll start to understand a bit more, and you'll see how you'll be a lot better at comprehension as time goes by. And I also read Spanish books now, but obviously it takes me a while to get to this point where I can do that. But there are books, beginner books out there that you can read that are literally children's books that, you know, are in the other language, but you can basically understand them through your common sense, right? That's another thing you can do. Reading is very, very key for learning a language. Now, I did have periods where I stopped learning and I wasn't focused on Spanish because life happens, right? And it doesn't become a priority. But as long as it's a priority in your life to learn a language, you should be doing it every single day. But even through these periods of not really focusing on language learning, I was still listening and immersing myself in some way. It just wasn't as active as my learning was in the past. I was kind of more passive, just listening to Spanish music, reggaeton, Ozuna, Anuel y los demás. Y incluso si no estuviera aprendiendo de un nivel muy intenso, aún estaba haciendo esas cositas que me ayudó a mantener el español en mi cabeza y en el frente de mi cabeza y mi cerebro y tal. Obviamente, os queráis la prueba que puedo hablar español, así que voy a hacerlo. Y quiero decir que aunque hablo español y puedo entender casi todo lo que escucho, hago errores todavía, ¿vale? No hablo perfectamente, pero para mí, la verdad es que cuando empecé a aprender español, mis intenciones fueron entender contenido en español y música y libros y tal, y ser capaz de hablar con nativos del idioma sin no entender lo que están diciendo, ¿vale? Y ya estoy a ese punto y literalmente puedo grabar un vídeo de YouTube en español que no es mi idioma nativo. Es un sentimiento muy raro, la verdad, porque obviamente en Inglaterra no hablamos español, no hablamos ni otro idioma, solamente es inglés y eso, ¿vale? Ya está. Y no hay mucha gente aquí que quieren aprender otro idioma. Es como, tenemos inglés y ya está. Pero obviamente el aprendizaje de idiomas es algo que me interesa muchísimo y voy a hacerlo y continuar a hacerlo con otros idiomas. Pero ahorita mi foco es español, porque en el futuro mi intención es quiero vivir en un país hispanohablante. Antes de enfocarme en francés o alemán a un punto de mi vida que quiero hacer, pero no ahorita, voy a continuar con mi español y quiero sonar más nativo antes de cambiar mi idioma y quiero que entiendo básicamente todo, porque hay ciertas cosas y acentos en español porque es un idioma muy rico que no entiendo, así que quiero básicamente perfectar cada cosa en el idioma. But yeah, there's your example of the fact that I can speak Spanish, so I'm not capping, alright guys? If I could give you a routine, this is what I would say. When you get up, start the day listening to Spanish, immerse yourself from minute 1. The second that you start deciding to consume content, make sure it's in the language that you want to learn. So if you're trying to learn Spanish, put a Spanish song on or a podcast or a TV show, even if you don't understand what they're saying at the start, because that's what it's going to be. A lot of learning languages is about persisting through the confusion. So a lot of the time you'll be like, what are they even saying? But you have to find little parts of the conversations that you can take and break down and things that you think might be useful. So when I'm listening to something in Spanish and I don't understand it, or at the start when I didn't understand anything and I heard something, I would think about what sounds achievable to actually learn and go from there. So even if I didn't memorize the whole meaning of a sentence, I would take the words that sounded reasonable for me to learn at the time, given my level, and go from there. So yeah, that's how I learned Spanish, and those are just some of the tips that I think will help you learn any language, right? And you can teach yourself. I have literally taught myself this language and it feels so good. It feels so good. I can just, it's just open new doors. I can do different things. I don't have to be staying in this rainy, boring country. I can go to another country that speaks Spanish and basically live there with no problems. Obviously, I'm gonna be a bit confused about a few things because there are obviously always gonna be words that I don't know, but for the most part, I can figure out what stuff means through the language itself, which is great. So anyway, if you're trying to learn language this year, those are the things to bear in mind, and that is what helped me. That's my journey. And do me a favor, leave me a comment what languages you're trying to learn and let me know what your goals are and where you are right now with it. Because I don't know many people like me who want to study languages the way I do. So it'd be interesting to see if there's any of you out there that kind of have the same mindset. So anyway, hasta luego.